After the great Elizabethan and Jacobean era, we're now turning to a shorter and perhaps less brilliant period, the period of Caroline and Commonwealth literature. Caroline, of course, refers to the reign of Charles I. Carolus in Latin is Charles. Commonwealth refers to the regime set up by Cromwell, the Republic, République du Bien Commun. So we have to do a bit of history before we turn to literature per se. When James I died in 1625, his son, Charles I, succeeded him peacefully. The new Stuart dynasty seemed secure and royal authority unchallenged. With a refined monarch, well educated in music, knowledgeable in sculpture and painting, literature and the arts seemed set for a brilliant period of patronage and refined taste. Commission of the banqueting house ceilings from Rubens, you can still see them today in London, architectural projects prepared with Inigo Jones, and of course permanent protection of Van Dyck, confirm the new king was certainly much more of a connoisseur than his father or even Elizabeth. Choice, order from above, limitations mandated by taste. Classicism in England might have come to prominence much earlier than it actually did. Here on the right, you've got one of the many portraits of Charles I, and very often his family as well, painted, of course, by Van Dyck, the most representative painter of this period. Yet this was not to be. Already simmering under James I, two major problems were bound to call into question England's political stability and ultimately result in the civil wars, because there were, I'm using the plural because there were several stages in the conflict between 1642 and 1651. Briefly summed up, this is not our core subject here. These two problems were the rise of Puritanism on the one hand, soon morphing into political protest and coinciding with the interests of parliamentarians, and on the other hand, the king's inability to raise taxes without Parliament's approval in order to fund near permanent deficits. Now, the Puritans were first a fringe of Protestants who felt the Reformation had not gone far enough, wanted the Church of England to move even further away from Rome and Catholicism, down to, for instance, the complete rejection of any organized structure with bishops. They hated that. And of course, these people were also believers in a number of very strict, you might even say extreme, dogmas such as predestination, and generally speaking, they wanted to impose on the rest of society their very stringent views on public and private morality. For some time, they had been repressed, and some of them, of course, as you know, were even expelled from England and went on to, create some of the American colonies, resulting, of course, much later on, in the United States of America. This fringe turned into something much more important, and in some urban areas, you might even say they were solid. I don't know if they were a majority, because, there was never a vote on these things, but nonetheless, they became very important, influent groups, especially because, as I said, their interests and ideas somehow coincided with those of the parliamentarians. This means mainly the members of the House of Commons, but also some nobility in the House of Lords who opposed the king. Faced with that growing opposition, the king was somehow paralyzed because he needed them to fund the deficits. He could not raise taxes without the approval of Parliament. And of course, Parliament wanted more than this limited power of granting or refusing taxes. By and by, Parliament started to call into question royal prerogative. In fact, the parliamentarians wanted political power. A third problem was probably Charles's long series of misguided decisions and mistaken policies, internal and foreign. As early as 1629, Parliament was indefinitely prorogued, that is, dismissed without any further, set date for them to be called again. And Charles attempted personal rule, 1629, 1640. This did not solve the problems. It only delayed the conflicts, which violently erupted again when the Long Parliament had to be called. Now, this Parliament is called the Long Parliament because it did not cease to sit all through the Civil War until Cromwell, who won the Civil War, actually booted out the members he disliked and reduced it to the so-called Rump Parliament in 1648. But by then, Charles was about to lose his head. As you know, Charles ended up beheaded on the scaffold in London in January 49, and this was, of course, a shattering event. It was the first time that a king had been condemned to death by rebellious subjects. The two parties were, of course, the so-called Cavaliers, because they mainly rode on horseback, and they had this, sort of carefree attitude to life. We'll come to that in a moment with the Cavalier poems. And the other side were the Roundheads. This is why I have used as a symbol for this lecture. I don't know if you can see it on the right side here on the margin. You have a Cavalier hat with a large flowing plume and feathers. And below you've got the typical Roundhead helmet. The Roundheads were called the Roundheads because they shaved their hair, whereas the Cavaliers wore those long flowing hairs or wigs, and the Cavaliers enjoyed and revelled in this display of beauty, whereas the Puritans thought, no, according to the Bible, a man ought not to wear long hair. He ought not to wear a wig. He had to be clean shaven. So again, you see, even on symbolic little details like this, there was a profound opposition.